So if you're interested in 3D light, and specifically the part of 3D light that includes outdoor lighting, and that could be outdoor lighting that's actually for the inside, but lighting that comes in through the windows, you have to understand what that light is composed of. So in a lot of cases, the sky can be lots of different colors, but if you're just trying to do what is the most normal and happens the most frequently, the sky is made of both the sun, the light from the sun, and also the clouds and the blueness of the sky behind the clouds. So what we're going to focus on right now is creating that mix of blue and clouds that you can use for many different things, whether you're talking about lighting the outside or if you're talking about lighting the inside using windows from the outside. So if we want to create an environment that has a cloud-based sky in it, first thing we need to do is set up the scene so we can see exactly what that's going to look like. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this default cube, and I'm going to add a plane. Now this plane is just gives us an idea of what the ground is. And normally at the scales we're talking about, there would be some curvature due to the earth, but we're not going to worry about that here. I am going to scale it up so that it's something similar to the scales that we care about when we're actually taking renders. So if I hit 7 to look at this from above, and I'm going to go ahead and make it so you can see the edge length. So if I select this, you can see that the edge length is 2 meters. So we're going to scale that up quite a bit. We're going to scale it up 1,500 times. So now if I scale out and tab in, you can see that we have now 3,000 meters, which I think is roughly 600 or so miles, just to keep things in the scales that we want in order to have a completely natural light. Now the problem with when you're doing things that are this big, the camera and the viewport is not really set up to see those distances. So what we're going to do now is change the view so we can see that. So for clipping distance, we're going to leave the 0.1 and we're going to change the end clipping distance to 1e10. And that just means 1 times 10 to the 10th. And that makes sure that's 1 with 10 zeros behind it. That makes sure that we can see everything in our scene. Now we're going to do the same thing for the camera. Right now the camera clipping distance, it's set up to end at 100 meters. So we're going to change that to 1e to the 10th, or 1 with 10 zeros behind it. And now our camera is going to be able to see those distances. So if we hit numpad 0, we're looking at the plane right now, but I'm going to click lock camera to view, and then I'm just going to shift my view so that I can see partly my surface that I just created and then the environment that we will create. So now that that's all set up, I'm going to create a dome. Now there's 2 ways to do this. You could do this with a dome, or you can do this using the world settings in Blender. I'm going to show you both. But the first way I'm going to show you is the dome method, just so you have a lot more control of it. So I'm going to add a UV sphere. And of course you can't see it at first, but if I hit numpad period, you can see that it's here. It's just really small. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, and now you can see all these numbers. That makes it much harder to see. So I'm going to go back into my menu here on the top side, and I'm going to unclick so I don't need to see those edge lengths. But I am going to scale it 1,500 times, just like I did the other environment. So now if we see our environment, we see that the dome is about the same size as the environment we just created. Now the next thing I'm going to do is scale this in the Z, right? And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm not making everything curved like the Earth's surface would be curved. So it's going to seem like if I left it as a big sphere, and if I hit 0 here, you can kind of see what this looks like. If I left it as a big sphere, it would seem like you were in a dome instead of on the earth. But we need the environment to have clouds and a ceiling that seems to go out farther above. So for that reason, we're bringing the sky a little bit closer to the ground, which is what it would look like if you were actually looking at an environment, because the clouds aren't in orbit, they're closer to the earth. The next thing we're going to do, I'm going to tab out into edit mode again, and I'm just going to scale this out, because that's how the sky would be. It'd be much bigger than the ground that we're looking at. And then I'm going to scale the Z down just a little bit more. And now we have this dome that we're inside of, right? And then when I hit 0 to look, numpad 0 to look through this, we see that we are inside of this dome. And we can, of course, make changes to this. You might be wondering why I'm tabbing into edit mode in order to do the scaling. And that's just so that whatever scaling I do is the default amount of scale. Like if I did all the scaling here, sometimes you get some artifacts and issues with the fact that you've scaled, but this is not actually the default scale that it's at. So I'm doing all my scaling in edit mode to make sure that that doesn't happen. So the next thing we want to do is actually create some of these textures for the globe. Now we're ready to create the texturing that we need for our sphere earth dome thing that we're creating here. And the first thing I'm going to do is change this bottom pane down here to the shader editor. And the reason I'm not using the workspaces for this, like I could pick different workspaces, and the reason I'm not picking the shading workspace is just because I don't need all this stuff on the side. I only need the 3D viewport and the shader editor. So this is just fine for me. So I'm going to create a new material. So I go to the materials tab, I click new, and I'm going to call this clouds because that's what we're doing. So I'll call this clouds, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this principal BSDF because we don't really need that right now. We do need the material output, but we don't need the clouds. So next thing I'm going to do is hit Shift A, search, and I'm going to use the noise texture. And you'll find that the noise texture is one of the most versatile textures that you have available to you. It's based on something called Perlin noise, and Blender has 2 of the Perlin noise filters, so it's a fractal pattern. And if you want more information on that, feel free to look it up on the internet, but it's really interesting. The next thing we're going to do is add a texture coordinate to this. So in order to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A again. I'm going to search, and just hitting TXT gives us that texture coordinate. I hit Shift A again because now I want the mapping. Now these 2 things give me the ability to control how the texture is distributed along the surface right now. So we're going to go with object at the moment and see if that works for us. And then I'm going to take the vector component by just left clicking here into the vector component of the noise. Now you don't see anything initially because we're not in the right viewport. So we want to be in the one that allows us to see or preview what the texture is. And that's this one here that is the second to the left. We're currently in Eevee, which is the real-time viewport, the real-time render engine. So that's perfectly fine for us to stay there. And if we look really closely, we can see this noise, which is what we have selected. But it turns out when you're doing clouds, it's also a type of noise, right? But what we don't have set up right now are the parameters we really want. So right now I happen to know that the scale we need is 9.0. And we also know that the detail we want is 6.9. And another thing we're going to add is a color ramp. Color ramps are really useful when we're doing anything like this because it allows us to control how much of the dark versus the light color or whatever 2 parameters that you're using. So right now, our material output is set. And you can see how we can kind of change that environment. So object doesn't look like it's giving us what we need, and we can switch to generated, and we see that that makes the biggest difference. So when we used object, the scale was really low, so we could have changed the scale, but generated does a much better job. So when we pick object, everything is based on the size of the environment and where the origin is, which is this orange dot here. So generated is giving us what we need here, and now you can see if I change where we have this slider, what our clouds look like also change, right? And this is how we can make changes to the environment. So I want everything to not necessarily be all clouds. So this gives us a set of smaller clouds, but why don't we have slightly bigger clouds here? So this gives us some cloudy skies here, and this is what we're looking for, but we're also going to add bigger clouds, because when you look at the sky, you have both small clouds and big clouds, and we're going to take those things and put them together. So we have the clouds on this scale, but we want to be able to add some variety in our sky. So we're going to add another set of clouds. So the easiest way to do that, I'm going to hit Control B for, I'm just going to hit B for box select, and we're going to box select these two. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate them because it's based on the same process. And I'm going to take left click on the mapping node and connect that to the noise texture node. And then I'm going to take this color ramp and I'm going to plug it into the material output. And you see that it gives us the same thing because they're identical at this point. But what we really want to do is change the scale of these clouds. So right now I'm going to increase this scale. And what I'm looking for is to give the clouds a bigger form factor than the one that we were using before. So as I look through this, I just want to get an environment that looks a little bit different. So you can see now that it's not quite as varied, and the sky and the clouds are a lot more gradual. So this gives us two completely different looks for the clouds. So if I plug the one into the top, you see that the clouds are a lot smaller, and if I plug this one into the bottom, you see that these clouds are much bigger. So now all we need to do is add them together. So if I hit Shift A, and what we're going to add, how we're going to add them is using the mix RGB. So we could use a mix shader, but at this point, really, we just want to mix colors. So we take the top one, which is our small clouds, and in order to keep track of what is what we can do is go over here and left click on the noise texture, and under label, we can actually say small clouds. That way, and you see here that it's changed, and we can do that same thing over here. So we can say big clouds. And I'm doing that because node trees and node texture, when you're using the node editor for doing different textures, things can get complicated. And I try to do what I can do so that if you come back and look at this, you know what in the world you were doing the first time. So I'm going to connect this bottom portion with the big clouds to our mix RGB, and then plug the mix RGB into our surface. So now you can see that we have both these small clouds and we also have these big clouds. And just to make things even more slightly complicated and more controllable, I'm going to add another color ramp. So Control A, search, I type in the color ramp. I could have done Shift D as well to duplicate one of the other color ramps we had. And now I can control all of the environment at once, or I can control the individual aspects. Like I can control just the smaller clouds, or I can control just the bigger clouds. And then I can also control how they're mixed together. So right now, the setting we have the mix RGB on is working perfectly for us. But I would say that we probably have too many of the big clouds. So rather than using the mix here, what I'm going to do is increase the black, and that's going to make them just slightly fewer. And this is looking really good to me. So you're looking at this and you're thinking, because I can read your mind, it's black and white. Like, why would we make this all black and white? So in order to make it the colors we want, all we have to do is use another mix RGB. So all I'm going to do this time is left click it. I'm going to hit Shift D, and I'm going to drop that in place. And this time I'm going to plug it into the factor. Now I'm going to delete this bottom one by holding down Control and right dragging through that. And I'm going to switch one of the colors to blue. So now you can see that we have some blue clouds. Now I'm going to change this to white so that you can see this a little bit better. And I'm just going to work with this until we have a sky color that we can agree on looks okay. So this, oh, we almost had it right about there. Actually, I happen to know because I did this before that the best color we need that's going to work for us, I'm going to go to hex and I'm just going to paste it here because I know that this color works the best. So if you want to use this, oops, let's undo that. So that's the color. Now if you want to use this yourself, you can see if I, now I keep changing it. I need to really stop doing that. So if I zoom in and you look at this, you can see that I have an R value of 0.061, 0.231. You can stop the video here, you can pause it and put this in for you. Or in the hex, you can just type 4684 capital E2. I don't think case really matters, but it might. And that gives us this here that looks like clouds in the sky. Now, if we take a look through our camera, we can see that, the clouds do the sky does look like it has some clouds. So we can also make these clouds a little bit darker, a little bit whiter here by using this color ramp. And that's the reason we put it here, is so we would have the control over these clouds. So now we have this environment, we're almost done, where the sky is both cloudy and blue. The next thing we need to do is control where these clouds start. We don't have to do this, but we do want to kind of control where the clouds are, because there might be a case where we want the clouds to kind of fade out at a certain portion. Right now, the way it's set up, you could completely use it like this and you'd be fine. But also it's a good way to show you how to kind of mask in and mask out different things. So in order to create a portion where below which there is no clouds, or there are no clouds, what we're going to do is we're going to create a mask using the gradient, right? And there are a bunch of ways to do this, but we're going to do this probably one of the easiest ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a separate XYZ, right? And as I plug in the separate XYZ, I'm going to also plug this in to the bottom node, right? And just to make things easier, I hit Shift, right click and drag, and I can add one of these connectors. And I'm just using that to make things look a little bit more easy to see. So if I look at my sphere or my oval now, you can see that it goes from black to white, which is a gradient. Now, this means that where it's black, the value is 0, and where it's white, the value is 1. So it goes from 0 to 1, which makes sense because we want a gradient. We could have used the gradient texture, and I'll just to give you an idea what that looks like, I'll show you what the gradient texture looks like. If I put the gradient texture in here and I plug that in and then plug this here, you can see that it gives us something exactly the same. But what it doesn't do is give us an easy way to control where this 0 is, right? So if I connect the X here, then this left side is 0. But if I connect the Y, you can see that something perpendicular. So let's look at this from above. So the X, once connected, is here from left to right. And if I do the Y, it's from top to bottom. And in this case, we want the horizon to kind of go with the line. So we're going to use the Z. So now the dark portion is the bottom, and which is 0, and the top is 1. So if we're going to use this as a mask, what we're telling Blender to do is the parts that are white are one thing and the parts that are black are another, and then mix them depending on how black or how white they actually are. So Z is what we're looking for, and why we're using separate XYZ. So the next thing we're going to do is add that all-important color ramp node, because that gives us control over where that is. And right now we want the horizon to be just here in the center. So I hit numpad 1 to see this from the side view or from the front view. And I'm going to shift this until it's right about here in the center. So now the bottom is black and the top is white. So if we were going to mix two different things, the mix would be different on the top from the bottom, which you obviously understand. So now that we have that gradient, we can begin to kind of mix. So now that we have the gradient we were talking about before, and we have these sets of clouds, I want to show you how to decide where these clouds are seen and where they're not. So we're going to kind of add what's kind of like a horizon line, but not actually a horizon line. So in order to do that, we need to use this color ramp here as a mask to tell Blender where we want it to show. So in order to do that, we are going to use another Mix RGB. So in order to do that, I'm gonna left click on it, hit Shift D, and then drop that in place. Now in this case, we want it to be the factor similar to what we had before. So I'm gonna hold down Control, right click and drag over, then connect that to the factor. Now I'm going to feed the clouds into the top portion. So right now the clouds I fed into the top portion, but it's not actually showing the clouds at the top. It's showing the clouds at the bottom. So in that case, I'm going to connect it to the bottom, and I'm going to cut it both by mistake. I'm going to connect it to the bottom this time. Is that what I just did? Nope. So I connected to the bottom, and I have just about what I'm looking for. So the very bottom is all blue, and the very top has this region with the clouds. Now, if we want the clouds to be slightly more prevalent, we can change that here with this color ramp slider, and that's why we put it there. So we could control everything kind of independently. So now we have the clouds at the top, and we have different variations of clouds around. Now, if I hit numpad 0 to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like through the camera, we can see that the clouds are very faint. And if that's what you want, that's fine. If it's not what you want, we can increase the white here and we can make them a lot more pronounced. You can also change how the clouds are actually being shown by changing this number, by changing this color ramp here. So you have a lot of control over how the clouds are manifested in your environment. Now, if you want to actually rotate the scene, there are a couple of ways to do that. The first way is we can just select the sphere, hit R for rotate and Z, and now we can just rotate the sky. Now this is a little bit simpler than we would do if we were using the world coordinates. We're using the world background to do that. And I'll show you how you could do that. The other thing you could do is to change it down here. So we're using the same mapping node for everything. So we could also change it here, but that changes kind of a lot about the environment from changing it back here. So you can see that we are rotating it, but we're getting a slightly different effect when we do that. So that's not the best way to do it. The easiest way to do that is for here is just to change the globe itself. And that's one of the reasons we created it like this, is because if we zoom out, we have ultimate control over how this is displayed. And if we want to rotate it, change it, scale it, we can do all of those things. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how you would apply this same node tree to the world environment instead of a dome. So in order to do that, I'm going to go in the same shader editor and I'm going to pick world. But before I do that, I'm going to hit B for box select, and I'm going to box select everything except the material output. And then I'm going to hit Control C to copy. And then I'm going to go to the world settings here, and just to make sure you can see everything I'm typing. So now I'm going to make sure that use nodes is selected. And now if I go also over to the world settings, it says here, I'm going to click use nodes, and you can see that that actually unclicks it. So in order to really know if you're using nodes, you need to look here and see and make sure that that is selected. Then I'm going to click over here and I'm going to say Control V, then G for grab, so I can move everything to the side. Now I'm going to take the output of our node tree from before and put that into the color of the background. Now you can't see this initially because of the type of shader preview we're in. We need to go to the render view in this case, and that's up here on the right side, the tab that's all the way to the right. And if we look at the sky, we can see the clouds that we put in, but unfortunately they're a bit too high. But luckily we have the ability here to bring it lower. So if I hit, if I go over here to the mask that kind of controls that, I can drag this to the left, and you can see that now that brings it down, right? And I can also hit the right side, and that will also increase the vibrance of it. So now I have this horizon line here. Now if you want it even lower, there's this Z portion here that will kind of change the look of it. So what you could also do is change the Z location here, and that would shift it as well. That's probably a kind of harder way to do it. The other thing you can do is over here in the color ramp node that controls this, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, select this one, and I'm just going to make it a little bit lighter, right? And as I make it a little bit lighter, you can see that our clouds start to reach farther down into our environment. So if you don't want that, if you want it to be a more specific line, you can make that darker here. And then you can control where that line is also by moving these by moving these sliders here. So we can't really zoom out and see anything, but we can look at the sky and give us an idea. Last thing we can do is look through the camera. Now we're actually looking at the dome here, but if I hit H, we can hide that, and now this is the actual sky that we created. So this is the sky, and if we want to see the dome, I'm going to hit Alt H to unselect that. And now if I go back to our object and I can change where that horizon line is, right? So if we want it to kind of fade out as it gets to the floor or the ground, we can do that, and that's what we have done here. And now if I zoom out, you can see what this looks like, and then you can see that we also have a bigger sky. So that's how you can create a sky that you have all control over.